In the heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, where ancient traditions clash with modern realities, lies a story that will challenge everything you think you know about love, family, and human dignity. Sarah Stoltzfus, a 28-year-old Amish woman weighing over 400 pounds, has become the burden her family never wanted. Shunned by potential suitors and considered unmarriageable, she faces a fate worse than spinsterhood when her own father arranges her marriage to her distant cousin, Jacob Miller, a 40-year-old widower struggling to raise his 3 young children alone. The bride price: 2 prized goats. What begins as a transaction born of desperation becomes a journey of unexpected love, profound acceptance, and the discovery that true beauty lies not in what the world sees, but in the depth of one's heart. But when Sarah's health begins to fail and dark family secrets emerge, Jacob must choose between the traditions that have defined his life and the woman who has transformed his world. This is not just a story about arranged marriage or weight struggles. It's about finding grace in the most unlikely places, discovering that love has no size limit, and learning that sometimes the most broken people create the most beautiful families. The wooden floorboards creaked ominously under Sarah's feet as she made her way down the narrow staircase of the Stoltzfus farmhouse. At 28, Sarah had long ago accepted that every step she took announced her presence like a bell tolling. The other women in the community moved like whispers through their daily routines, but Sarah moved like thunder. "Sarah, come quickly." Her mother's voice carried the familiar edge of embarrassment mixed with urgency. "Bishop Lapp is here." Sarah's heart sank. Bishop visits were never good news in the Stoltzfus household, especially when they concerned her. She paused at the bottom of the stairs, smoothing her plain blue dress over her considerable frame. The fabric, specially ordered from town because nothing in the community could accommodate her size, always made her feel like she was wearing a flag of her difference. Through the kitchen window she could see her father, Eli Stoltzfus, standing rigid beside the bishop in the backyard. Both men's faces were grim, their black hats casting shadows over expressions Sarah had learned to read all too well: disappointment, shame, the weight of a problem that needed solving. "What does he want, ma?" Sarah asked her mother, Rebecca, who was frantically wiping down already clean surfaces. Rebecca Stoltzfus was a thin, nervous woman whose life had been spent apologizing for things beyond her control. Her daughter's size had been the greatest of these burdens. "He wants to speak with you about your future." The word hung in the air like smoke. At 28, Sarah's future was a topic that kept her parents awake at night. In a community where women married young and started families immediately, Sarah was an anomaly that challenged the natural order of things. She was past marriageable age, past the point where anyone could pretend this was just a phase, past the point where hope lived. Sarah walked to the kitchen window and watched her father gesture emphatically at something beyond her view. She knew what he was pointing at, the small cemetery where her grandmother was buried, where someday Sarah would likely rest as a spinster, having never contributed to the continuation of their faith through children of her own. Her mother's voice was softer now, touched with the kind of pity that hurt more than anger. "You know we love you. You know we've tried everything." They had tried everything: special diets blessed by the church elders, herbal remedies from the old women, even allowing Dr. Peterson from town to examine Sarah, breaking the community's usual reluctance to involve outsiders in their affairs. Nothing had worked. If anything, Sarah had grown larger over the years, her body seemingly determined to take up more space in a world that had no room for her. The kitchen door opened with a sharp bang, and Eli Stoltzfus entered, followed by Bishop Lapp. The bishop was a severe man in his 60s, whose presence could make even the most righteous community member examine their conscience for hidden sins. "Sarah," the bishop said, removing his hat, "sit down. We need to talk." Sarah lowered herself carefully into the reinforced chair her father had built specifically for her. Even this act, performed hundreds of times, carried its own shame. The way everyone waited for her to settle, the slight relief in their faces when the chair held, the careful distance they maintained as if her condition might be contagious. "Sarah," Bishop Lapp began, his voice carrying the authority of generations, "you're a burden to your family and to our community." The words hit like physical blows, even though Sarah had heard variations of them her entire adult life. But hearing them spoken so plainly by the bishop made them official, irrefutable. "Your father has 5 other daughters to see married. Your presence in this house makes it difficult for him to arrange proper matches for them. Men look at this family and see complications." Sarah's younger sisters ranged in age from 16 to 25. All were of normal size, all were considered desirable matches within the community. But Sarah's presence cast a shadow over them all. What if her condition was somehow hereditary? What if marrying into the Stoltzfus family meant risking children who might struggle as Sarah did? "We found a solution," her father said, his voice lacking its usual strength. "Jacob Miller has agreed to take you as his wife." Sarah's breath caught. Jacob Miller, she knew him by reputation. A widower at 40, father to 3 young children, a man whose wife had died in childbirth 2 years ago. He lived on a small farm on the outskirts of the community, struggling to maintain his land and raise his children alone. "Jacob needs a wife to help with his children and his household." The bishop continued, "You need a husband to give your life purpose and meaning. It's a practical arrangement." Practical arrangement. The words echoed in Sarah's mind. Not a marriage born of love, or even compatibility, but a transaction designed to solve 2 problems at once. "What about what I want?" The question escaped before Sarah could stop it, and she immediately regretted her boldness. Her father's face reddened. "What you want?" "Sarah, you're 28 years old and unmarried. You live in my house, eat my food, and contribute nothing to this family's future. What you want is the luxury of someone who has choices. You have none." The harsh truth of his words settled over the room like dust. Sarah looked at her mother, hoping for some sign of support, some indication that someone in this room saw her as more than a problem to be solved. But Rebecca avoided her gaze, focusing instead on folding and refolding a dish towel. "Jacob has agreed to the match," the bishop said. "The wedding will take place in 3 weeks, at the end of harvest season." "What did he ask for?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Her father and the bishop exchanged glances. This was clearly a detail they had hoped to avoid discussing. 2 goats, her father said finally. "My best breeding does." The room fell silent. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, a final snapping of whatever pride she had managed to maintain. She was worth 2 goats. Not a dowry paid for her hand, but a price paid to take her off her family's hands. "Jacob Miller is a good man," the bishop said, his voice gentler now, perhaps recognizing that even someone in Sarah's position had feelings that could be wounded. "He'll treat you fairly, his children need a mother, and his farm needs a woman's touch. You'll have purpose, Sarah. You'll finally have a place where you belong." Purpose, place. These were words that had been missing from Sarah's life for so long that they seemed foreign now. But at what cost? To be married to a man who saw her as a solution to his problems rather than as a woman worthy of love. After the bishop left, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen while her parents discussed arrangements in hushed tones on the porch. Through the window she could see them gesturing, no doubt planning how to make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. Everyone except her. The late afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table, where she had eaten thousands of meals, where she had learned to read from her mother's Bible, where she had spent countless hours feeling like a stranger in her own home. In 3 weeks, she would leave this house, not as a celebrated bride, but as a problem finally solved. She would go to Jacob Miller's farm, to his children, to a life built on necessity rather than love. She would become a wife not because someone had chosen her, but because someone had been willing to accept her. But perhaps Sarah thought as she watched her father count out the cost of her marriage and livestock. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps after 28 years of being unwanted, being needed was a kind of gift. Even if it came at the price of 2 goats. The sun set behind the barn, and Sarah remained in the kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a household preparing for evening chores. Soon these sounds would be memories. Soon she would wake up in a different kitchen, in a different life, as a different person. Mrs. Jacob Miller, wife, stepmother, woman with a purpose. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to feel something that might have been hope. It was fragile, barely more than a whisper in her heart, but it was there. Maybe Jacob Miller would see something in her that others had missed. Maybe his children would accept her. Maybe, just maybe, she could build something beautiful from this practical arrangement. But first, she had to survive the next 3 weeks, and the wedding that would change everything. Jacob Miller stood in his barn at dawn, pitchfork in hand, but his mind was nowhere near his morning chores. The hay lay scattered at his feet, while he stared at the empty stall where 2 prize goats would soon live. The goats that would pay for his new wife. At 40, Jacob had calloused hands that told the story of 22 years of hard farming. But today those hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden handle. 3 days had passed since Bishop Lapp had approached him with the arrangement. 3 days of sleepless nights and wrestling with a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. "Dad, are you coming for breakfast?" The small voice belonged to his youngest daughter, Mary, who stood in the barn doorway in her tiny nightgown, her blonde hair escaping from her sleeping braid. At just 4 years old, she had no memory of her mother, Rachel, who had died giving birth to her. But his other 2 children did remember, and that made everything harder. "Just finishing up here, little one," Jacob said, forcing a smile as he set down the pitchfork. "Go tell your brother and sister I'll be right in." Mary skipped away, her bare feet pattering across the wooden porch of their modest farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, Jacob could see 8-year-old Emma trying to manage breakfast for her younger siblings, while 12-year-old Daniel sat at the table, his face already set in the permanent scowl he'd worn since his mother's death. This was why he had agreed to the marriage. This exact scene, children trying to raise themselves, a household falling apart, a farm that demanded more time than he could give while also being a father. He needed help, desperately, and the community had made it clear that his options were limited. "Most of the available women are too young," Bishop Lapp had explained 3 days ago as they sat in Jacob's kitchen after the children were asleep. "And the widows have their own situations. Sarah Stoltzfus is practical. She needs a home, you need a wife and mother for your children. It solves 2 problems. Practical. The word had echoed in Jacob's mind for days. His marriage to Rachel had been anything but practical. It had been a love match that had scandalized both their families because of their 8-year age difference. Rachel had been 18 and radiant, the most beautiful girl in 3 counties, and somehow she had chosen him. Their 10 years together had been the happiest of his life. But Rachel was gone, and he was left with 3 children who needed stability more than he needed romance. Jacob walked toward the house, pausing to look at the small cemetery plot behind the oak tree where Rachel was buried. He visited her grave every morning, a ritual that helped him face each day. Today, he knelt beside the simple wooden cross that marked her resting place.
"I don't know what I'm doing, Rachel,"
he whispered, his voice rough in the morning air. "The children need a mother, and I can't do this alone anymore, but it feels like I'm betraying you." The wind rustled through the oak leaves, and Jacob closed his eyes, remembering the sound of Rachel's laugh, the way she had made even the hardest days feel manageable. She had been tiny, barely 5 feet tall, and never more than 100 pounds soaking wet. The contrast between his late wife and Sarah Stoltzfus was so stark it felt almost cruel. He had seen Sarah around the community, of course. It was impossible not to notice her, though everyone politely pretended otherwise. She was a kind woman. He had observed her at church functions, had seen how gentle she was with children, how she always volunteered to help with food preparation, despite the whispered comments about her eating too much of what she cooked. But the thought of replacing Rachel with Sarah felt like trading sunlight for shadow. "That Emma burned the eggs again." Daniel's voice carried across the yard, tinged with the frustration that seemed to color everything he said these days. Jacob rose from beside Rachel's grave and walked to the house, where chaos greeted him. Emma stood at the stove, tears streaming down her face as she stared at a pan of blackened eggs. Mary was crying because she was hungry. Daniel sat with his arms crossed, glaring at the world. "It's all right, Emma," Jacob said gently, taking the pan from his daughter's hands. "We'll make more." "I can't do anything right," Emma sobbed. "I try to help, but I just make everything worse. I miss Mam so much, and I can't remember how she used to make the eggs just right." Jacob's heart broke a little more. Emma had taken on responsibilities no 8-year-old should bear, trying to fill a role she was far too young for. Daniel had retreated into anger and defiance, mourning the loss of their mother by rejecting anyone who tried to help. And Mary, sweet Mary, was growing up without the gentle guidance only a mother could provide. As he scraped the burned eggs into the slop bucket and started fresh ones, Jacob made his decision, not because he wanted to, not because it felt right, but because his children needed more than he could give them alone. After breakfast, he walked to the Stoltzfus farm. The walk took 20 minutes across fields, dotted with corn stubble and patches of late-season wildflowers. Jacob had made this walk many times over the years. The Stoltzfus family had always been good neighbors, quick to help during harvest or when illness struck. But today the familiar path felt like a march toward an execution. Eli Stoltzfus was mending fence when Jacob arrived, his movements sharp and efficient. He looked up as Jacob approached, and something passed between the two men, an understanding born of desperation on both sides. "Jacob," Eli said, setting down his tools, "I wondered if you might come by." "I've decided to accept the arrangement," Jacob said without preamble. There seemed no point in drawing out what was already painful for everyone involved. Eli nodded slowly. "Sarah's a good girl. She'll work hard for you and she's wonderful with children. My youngest daughters adore her." "Where is she?" Jacob asked, realizing he should probably speak to his future bride before finalizing their engagement. "In the garden, harvesting the last of the tomatoes." Eli pointed toward the back of the house. "Jacob, I know this isn't easy for either of you, but sometimes the best marriages come from the most unexpected places." Jacob doubted that, but he nodded and made his way around the house to the large garden behind it. He found Sarah kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, her broad back to him, as she carefully picked ripe fruit and placed it in a wooden basket. She moved with surprising grace despite her size, her hands gentle with the delicate vines. She startled and turned, nearly losing her balance before catching herself against a fence post. Her face flushed red with embarrassment and something else, fear perhaps, or resignation. "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, struggling to rise from her kneeling position, "I didn't hear you coming." Jacob stepped forward instinctively to help her up, then stopped himself, unsure if the gesture would be welcome, or would only add to her embarrassment. Sarah managed to stand on her own, brushing dirt from her apron with hands that shook slightly. She was even larger than he had remembered, her plain brown dress straining across her considerable frame. But her face, framed by wisps of brown hair that had escaped her prayer covering, was kind. Her eyes, a soft hazel green, held intelligence and dignity despite her obvious discomfort. "I came to talk to you about the arrangement," Jacob said, feeling awkward and cruel. "How did one discuss an arranged marriage with someone you barely knew?" "You mean the marriage?" Sarah said with a bitter laugh. "You can say the word, Mr. Miller. I know what this is." Her directness caught him off guard. He had expected meekness, perhaps gratitude. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman who was clearly struggling but refusing to be pitied. "Yes, the marriage," he said. "I wanted to make sure you understood what you'd be taking on. 3 children, a farm that needs work, a man who—" He paused, unsure how to finish. A man who loved his wife and wishes he didn't have to replace her. Sarah finished for him. I understand perfectly, Mr. Miller. You need help with your children and your household. I need a home and a purpose. It's practical. That word again. Jacob studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of heartbreak or resentment, but found only a kind of weary acceptance that made him feel worse than tears would have. I'll be a good mother to your children, Sarah continued. I'll keep your house clean and your meals prepared. I'll work hard and ask for very little in return. All I ask is that you treat me with basic kindness and respect. The simplicity of her request hit Jacob like a physical blow. Basic kindness and respect, things that should be given freely in any relationship, but which she felt she needed to negotiate for. Of course, he said quickly, Sarah, this situation isn't ideal for either of us, but I promise you'll be treated well in my home. You'll have a place there, a real place. Something shifted in Sarah's expression, surprise perhaps, that he would acknowledge her humanity so directly. When? She asked. 2 weeks from Sunday, after harvest is complete. Sarah nodded, then bent to pick up her basket of tomatoes. I should get these inside before they spoil. As she walked toward the house, Jacob watched her go, noting how she held herself with dignity despite everything. This woman who had been valued at 2 goats, moved like someone who knew her worth, was greater than what the world assigned her. Walking home across the fields, Jacob felt the weight of his decisions settling around him like a heavy cloak. In 2 weeks, he would marry Sarah Stoltzfus. She would come to his home, become mother to his children, partner in his struggles. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but perhaps, as Eli had suggested, good things could grow from unexpected beginnings. That night, after the children were asleep, Jacob sat in the kitchen where he and Rachel had shared so many quiet evenings. The house felt emptier than usual, as if it were already preparing for the changes to come. In 2 weeks, these rooms would echo with a different voice, a different presence. Sarah would sit in Rachel's chair, cook at Rachel's stove, sleep in Rachel's bed. The thought should have filled him with grief, but instead, Jacob found himself feeling something unexpected, curiosity. Who was Sarah Stoltzfus, beyond her size, beyond her family's shame, beyond the community's whispers? What dreams did she harbor? What thoughts occupied her mind during the long nights when she lay awake, knowing she was unwanted? In 2 weeks, he would begin to find out, and perhaps, in learning who Sarah truly was, he would discover whether a marriage born of necessity could ever become something more. The morning of her wedding, Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of rain pattering against her bedroom window. She lay still for a long moment, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the house where she had spent 28 years, knowing she would never wake up here again. Her wedding dress hung on a peg beside the window, a simple blue garment that her mother and sisters had spent weeks altering and re-altering, trying to make it fit Sarah's considerable frame without looking like a tent. Even with all their efforts, Sarah knew she would look nothing like the radiant Amish brides the community was accustomed to seeing. Sarah, her youngest sister Ruth, peeked around the bedroom door. At 16, Ruth was everything Sarah was not: petite, graceful, with the kind of delicate beauty that made young men stumble over their own feet. Ma'am says it's time to get ready. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like preparation for a funeral than a wedding. Sarah's sisters moved around her with careful efficiency, braiding her hair, pinning her prayer covering, helping her into the dress that represented months of careful calculation about fabric and seams. Her mother, Rebecca, stood in the doorway watching with tears in her eyes, but Sarah couldn't tell if they were tears of joy for her daughter's wedding or relief that a long burden was finally being lifted from the family. "You look lovely," Rebecca said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her wash basin. The blue dress, despite all the alterations, strained across her body. Her face, flushed from the morning's preparations, looked round and uncertain above the stiff collar. She looked like exactly what she was, A woman who had never expected to be a bride, wearing a wedding dress that had been made out of duty rather than joy. "I need a moment alone," Sarah said quietly. Her mother and sisters filed out, leaving Sarah standing in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the memories of 28 years. Her books, carefully hidden behind her sewing basket because too much reading was considered prideful for a woman. Her journal filled with thoughts and dreams she had never shared with anyone. Her small collection of wildflowers, pressed between pages of the Bible and forgotten there years ago. All of it would stay here when she left. Miss Jacob Miller would have no need for the secret dreams of Sarah Stoltzfus. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Sarah, it's time." The wedding itself was a simple affair, as all Amish weddings were. The ceremony took place in the Stoltzfus barn, cleared of animals and filled with wooden benches borrowed from neighboring families. The entire community had come, not, Sarah suspected, out of joy for her happiness, but out of curiosity to witness the unusual match. Sarah walked down the makeshift aisle between the benches, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, on Jacob Miller, who stood waiting beside Bishop Lapp. Jacob wore his best black suit, his beard neatly trimmed, his face composed but unreadable. When she reached the front of the barn, Jacob stepped forward and offered her his arm, a small gesture of courtesy that surprised her. His touch was gentle, respectful, and Sarah felt a tiny flutter of something that might have been hope. Bishop Lapp began the ceremony with a reading from Scripture about the duties of husbands and wives. Sarah had heard these same words at dozens of weddings over the years, but now they seemed directed specifically at her, carrying weight they had never held before. "Do, Jacob Miller, take Sarah Stoltzfus to be your wife, to love and cherish her in sickness and health, in plenty and in want, for as long as you both shall live." "I do." Jacob's voice was steady, carrying across the silent barn. "Do you, Sarah Stoltzfus, take Jacob Miller to be your husband, to honor and obey him, to be helpmate and companion, for as long as you both shall live?" Sarah's voice caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't push the words past the tightness in her chest. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Once she said yes, she would become Jacob's wife, stepmother to his children, mistress of a household that had never been meant for her. "I do," she whispered, the words barely audible. Bishop Lapp pronounced them husband and wife, and Jacob turned to face her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, two strangers bound together by necessity and tradition. Then Jacob leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender and unexpected that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. The congregation began to sing, their voices joining in the ancient hymn traditionally sung at Amish weddings. But Sarah heard the words, as if for the first time, "Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love. The fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above." As the voices rose around them, Jacob offered Sarah his arm again, and together they walked down the aisle as husband and wife. Sarah kept her head high, even as she felt the whispers following in their wake. Let them talk. She was married now. She belonged somewhere. The reception was held in the same barn, with long tables laden with traditional wedding foods. Roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, fresh bread and pies made by the women of the community. Sarah sat at the head table beside Jacob, barely touching her food while watching the celebration swirl around them. Jacob's children sat nearby, and Sarah studied them carefully. These three young people who were now her responsibility. Emma, the 8-year-old, kept stealing glances at Sarah with curiosity rather than hostility. Daniel, 12 and clearly reluctant to be there, picked at his food with the sullen expression he seemed to wear everywhere. Little Mary, only 4, had fallen asleep against her father's shoulder despite the noise and activity around them. "They're good children," Jacob said quietly, noticing her attention. It's been hard for them since their mother died." "I understand," Sarah replied. "I won't try to replace her. I'll just try to be what they need." Something shifted in Jacob's expression, surprise perhaps, at her wisdom. That's all any of us can do. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself watching Jacob interact with the wedding guests. He was well respected in the community. She could see that. Men sought his opinion on farming matters. Women asked after his children's welfare. Young people showed him the kind of deference reserved for elders who had earned their place through hard work and good character. It struck her that Jacob Miller could have had his pick of wives if he had been willing to wait. Younger women, prettier women, women who would have brought dowries rather than costing him 2 goats. The fact that he had chosen practicality over romance said something about his character, but Sarah wasn't sure if it was something good or something resigned. As evening approached and the celebration began to wind down, Sarah felt a growing sense of panic. Soon she would have to go home with Jacob. To his house, his children, his bed. The reality of what marriage meant, all of it crashed over her like a cold wave. Ready? Jacob appeared at her elbow as the last of the guests began to depart. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She hugged her parents goodbye. Her father's embrace was brief and awkward, her mother's tearful and clinging. Her sisters clustered around her, promising to visit soon, though Sarah wondered if they would. She was moving to the edge of the community, both geographically and socially. It would be easy for them to let her fade from their daily lives. Jacob had brought his wagon for the short journey to his farm. He helped Sarah climb up to the seat beside him, his hands steady and respectful. The children climbed into the back, Emma and Mary chattering quietly to each other, Daniel maintaining his sullen silence. The ride to Jacob's farm took only 15 minutes, but it felt like a journey to another world. As they turned up the lane to the farmhouse, Sarah saw her new home for the first time in the gentle light of early evening. It was smaller than her family's house, but well maintained. The white clapboard siding gleamed in the fading light, and flower boxes beneath the windows held the last brave blooms of autumn. A large oak tree shaded the front yard, its leaves turning gold and red in the October air. "It's lovely," Sarah said, and meant it. Jacob looked pleased. "Rachel planted those flowers," he said, nodding toward the window boxes. "Emma's been trying to keep them alive, but she doesn't quite have her mother's touch yet." The mention of Rachel, casual, natural, somehow made Sarah feel both better and worse. Better because Jacob wasn't trying to pretend his first wife had never existed. Worse because the comparison was unavoidable. Rachel had made this house beautiful. What could Sarah offer that would measure up to that legacy? Jacob helped her down from the wagon while the children ran ahead into the house. For a moment, Sarah and Jacob stood alone in the gathering dusk. Husband and wife, 2 strangers about to begin a life together. "Sarah," Jacob said, his voice careful, "I want you to know tonight, I don't expect, that is, I know this marriage isn't, we can take things slowly. There's no rush for anything." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and gratitude. She had been dreading this moment all day, the wedding night, the intimacy that marriage implied. The idea that Jacob understood her anxiety and was offering her time was more kindness than she had dared hope for. "Thank you," she whispered. "Emma has been sleeping in Mary's room since," Jacob cleared his throat. "Since their mother died. She can continue doing that for now. And you can have Emma's room until you're comfortable. Until you're comfortable. Not until he decided it was time, but until she was ready." Sarah looked at her new husband in the fading light and felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually become trust. "Come on," Jacob said gently. "Let me show you your new home." As they walked toward the house together, Sarah realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was what she had dreamed of, not because it was what she had chosen, but because she was needed here. Jacob needed a wife. His children needed a mother, and this household needed someone to hold it together. It wasn't love, not yet, and maybe not ever, but it was purpose, and for Sarah Stoltzfus Miller, that felt like a kind of miracle. The screen door creaked as Jacob held it open for her, and Sarah stepped across the threshold into her new life. Sarah woke on her first morning as Mrs. Jacob Miller to the sound of a child crying. For a moment she lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by the scents and shadows of Emma's small room. Then memory rushed back. The wedding, the quiet evening meal with Jacob and his children, the awkward goodnights, and finally the relief of closing the bedroom door on her first day as a married woman. But someone was crying, and instinct overrode uncertainty. Sarah rose quickly, grabbed her robe and followed the sound down the narrow hallway to Mary's room. She found 4-year-old Mary sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face, while 8-year-old Emma knelt beside her, looking helpless. "She had a bad dream," Emma whispered when she saw Sarah in the doorway. "She always gets them, but I don't know how to make them stop. That usually comes, but he's already gone to milk the cows." Sarah approached the bed slowly, unsure of her welcome. Mary looked up at her with tear-filled blue eyes, Jacob's eyes, Sarah realized, and something in the child's expression broke through her hesitation. "What was the dream about, little one?" Sarah asked gently, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "The dark monster came back." Mary hiccuped. "It took Mam away, and now it wants to take Dad too." Sarah's heart clenched. This child had been barely 2 when her mother died in childbirth. The trauma had clearly left deep scars that manifested in nighttime terrors. "There's no monster here," Sarah said softly. "Would you like me to check under the bed and in the closet, just to be sure?" Mary nodded solemnly. Sarah made a great show of looking in every corner of the small room, even opening the window to peer outside. "All clear," she announced. "No monsters anywhere. They don't like houses where people love each other, you know." "Really?" Mary's voice was small, but interested. "Really, love is like sunshine to monsters. It makes them shrivel up and disappear." Sarah settled back beside Mary. "And this house has so much love in it. Your dad loves you and Emma and Daniel so much, and now I'm here too. And I already care about you very much." It was true, Sarah realized with surprise. In less than 24 hours, she had already begun to feel protective of these children who had been thrust into her care. Mary considered this seriously. "Will you stay until the sun comes up, to keep the monsters away?" Sarah looked at Emma, who was watching this interaction with curious hope. "If that's what you need, then yes, I'll stay right here." She spent the next hour sitting beside Mary's bed, telling quiet stories about brave little girls and protective angels until the child drifted back to sleep. When she finally crept back to her own room, she found Emma following her. "Thank you," Emma whispered. "Mary's nightmares have been so bad since Mam died. And Dad tries, but he doesn't know the right things to say." "What about you?" Sarah asked gently. "Do you have bad dreams too?" Emma's composure crumbled. "Sometimes. But I'm supposed to be the big sister. I'm supposed to help take care of everyone." 8 years old, Sarah thought sadly, and carrying the weight of a household on her narrow shoulders. "Emma, you're still a little girl yourself. It's not your job to be the mother. But who else will do?" Emma's question was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I will," Sarah said firmly. "That's why I'm here now. You can just be Emma, 8 years old, curious about the world, allowed to be a child." Emma looked at her with such hope that Sarah felt the full weight of her new responsibilities settle on her shoulders. These children needed more than a housekeeper and cook. They needed someone to heal the wounds left by their mother's death, someone to help them feel safe and loved again. The next few weeks fell into a routine that surprised Sarah with its naturalness. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, packed lunch pails for Jacob and Daniel, walked Emma and Mary to the one-room schoolhouse, and then returned home to tackle the endless tasks of running a household. But it was the evenings that began to feel like something resembling family life. Daniel remained sullen and resistant, but Emma started lingering in the kitchen after dinner to help with dishes and share stories from school. Mary became Sarah's shadow, following her around the house and chattering constantly about everything and nothing. And Jacob Jacob watched it all with expression Sarah couldn't quite read. He was unfailingly polite, always grateful for her efforts, but maintained a careful distance that reminded her daily that this was an arrangement, not a romance. 3 weeks into her marriage, Sarah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard raised voices from the barn. Through the open door she could see Jacob and Daniel facing off, both of them red-faced with anger. "I don't want to do chores," Daniel was shouting. "I want to go hunting with Samuel Yoder." "The work doesn't stop because you'd rather be somewhere else," Jacob replied firmly. "The animals need tending, and you're old enough to help. I hate this place. I hate everything about living here." Daniel's voice cracked with emotion. "And I hate her." He pointed toward the house, toward Sarah. "She's not my mother and she never will be." Sarah felt the words like a physical blow, but she forced herself to keep hanging clothes, to pretend she hadn't heard. She had expected resistance from Daniel. 12 was a difficult age under the best circumstances, and losing his mother had clearly left him angry at the world. "Daniel Miller, you will not speak that way about Sarah." Jacob's voice carried a warning tone Sarah had never heard before. "She has done nothing but care for this family since the day she arrived." "I don't care. I didn't ask for a new mother, especially not." The cruel emphasis on the last word made Sarah's hands still on the laundry. She knew what Daniel meant. Not just any replacement for his beloved mother, but specifically her, the fat woman his father had bought for 2 goats. "Go to your room," Jacob said quietly. "We'll discuss this later." Sarah heard Daniel storm out of the barn, his footsteps pounding across the yard and into the house. A few moments later, Jacob appeared beside her at the clothesline. "Sarah, I'm sorry about what you heard." "He's grieving," Sarah said without looking at him. "I understand. That doesn't make it acceptable." Jacob reached for a wet sheet, helping her spread it across the line. "Daniel has been angry since Rachel died. He blames God. He blames me. And now he's blaming you. But it's not about you. Not really." Sarah nodded, but the words still stung. She had hoped that her patience and kindness might gradually win Daniel over, but clearly his resentment ran deeper than she had realized. That evening, after Emma and Mary had gone to bed, Sarah knocked on Daniel's bedroom door. She found him lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling with red-rimmed eyes. "Can I come in?" she asked. Daniel shrugged, which Sarah took as permission. She settled into the chair beside his desk, noting the carefully preserved collections that spoke of a boy's interests: rocks, feathers, carved wooden animals. "You made these?" she asked, picking up one of the carved figures, a perfect miniature of a barn cat. "Ma'am taught me," Daniel said grudgingly, "before she got sick with Mary." Sarah studied the carving, impressed by its detail and craftsmanship. "You're very talented. Your mother must have been proud." Daniel sat up, his eyes blazing. "Don't talk about my mother. You didn't know her." "You're right, I didn't," Sarah said calmly. "But I can see her in you, and in Emma and Mary. I can see her in the way your father still looks sad sometimes when he thinks no one is watching. She must have been very special." Daniel's anger wavered, replaced by confusion. This wasn't the response he had expected. "She was beautiful," he said finally. "She was small and pretty and everyone loved her. She made the best apple pie in 3 counties, and she could sing like an angel." Sarah nodded. "She sounds wonderful. And you're afraid that if you accept me, if you let yourself care about me even a little bit, it means you're forgetting her." Daniel stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Sarah had hit closer to the truth than he was comfortable with. "I'm not trying to replace your mother, Daniel," Sarah continued. "I could never do that, and I wouldn't want to. But I am here, and I care about you and Emma and Mary very much. Caring about me doesn't mean you love your mother any less." "But you're so different from her," Daniel blurted out, then immediately looked stricken at his rudeness. Sarah smiled sadly. "Yes, I am. I'm not small or pretty, and I can't sing at all. But I can love you just as much as she did, in my own way. Love isn't about being the same as someone else. It's about showing up, day after day, and caring about someone's happiness more than your own comfort." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "I miss her so much," he whispered finally. "Of course you do, and you always will, and that's exactly how it should be. Missing her means she was worth missing." Sarah stood up slowly. "I'm going to keep caring about you, Daniel, whether you want me to or not, because that's what mothers do, even the substitute kind." As she reached the door, Daniel's voice stopped her. "Sarah," she turned back. "Your apple pie isn't terrible," he said quietly. It's actually pretty good." It was the smallest of olive branches, but Sarah treasured it. "Thank you, Daniel. That means a lot to me." Walking back to her room, Sarah felt something shift in her chest. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt like she might actually succeed at this impossible task of becoming a mother to children who already had one in their hearts, where it mattered most. But as she prepared for bed, Sarah caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. The reflection that looked back at her was tired, older than her 28 years, still wearing the body that had made her unwanted in her birth family. She was finding her place in this household. Slowly and carefully, the children were beginning to accept her. Jacob treated her with increasing respect, and she was discovering that she had a gift for nurturing that had never been allowed to flourish before. But late at night, alone in her borrowed room, Sarah still wondered if this careful arrangement they had built could ever become something more, and whether a woman like her, bought for 2 goats and grateful for the transaction, could ever dare to hope for love. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across Lancaster County with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. By December, snow lay 3 feet deep around the Miller farmhouse, and the wind howled through the bare oak branches like a living thing in pain. Sarah had been married to Jacob for 2 months now, and life had settled into rhythms that felt almost natural. Almost. There were still moments, many of them when she caught Jacob staring into the distance with an expression that spoke of loss and longing. There were still nights when she lay awake in Emma's small bed, listening to the sounds of a household that wasn't quite hers, wondering if she would ever truly belong anywhere. But there had been progress too. Daniel had begun helping her with dinner preparations, his sullen silence gradually replaced by tentative conversation about school and his wood-carving project. Emma had taken to crawling into Sarah's bed during thunderstorms, seeking the comfort she couldn't quite remember receiving from her birth mother. And Mary, sweet, trusting Mary, had begun calling her Mom Sarah, a compromise that honored both the woman who gave her life and the one who was helping her live it. It was on a particularly bitter December morning that everything changed. Sarah woke to the sound of Jacob coughing, deep, rattling coughs that seemed to echo through the thin walls of the farmhouse. She lay still for a moment, listening, then rose quickly and padded down the hallway to his bedroom door. "Jacob?" she called softly. "Are you all right?" The coughing stopped. "I'm fine," came his hoarse reply. "Just a cold." But when Jacob appeared for breakfast an hour later, Sarah could see it was much more than a cold. His face was flushed with fever, his breathing was labored, and he moved like a man fighting against his own body. "You should go back to bed," Sarah said, studying his face with growing concern. "Can't," Jacob said shortly, pulling on his heavy coat. "The animals need tending, and there's wood to chop before the next storm hits." "Then let Daniel help you," Sarah suggested, "or ask Samuel Yuda to come by." Jacob's jaw set stubbornly. "I can manage my own farm." He was gone before Sarah could argue further, leaving her standing in the kitchen with a growing sense of unease. Through the window, she watched him struggle toward the barn, his gait unsteady, his shoulders hunched against more than just the cold. By noon, Jacob was worse. Sarah found him in the barn, leaning heavily against a stall door, his breathing so labored she could hear it from across the aisle. "That's enough," she said firmly. "You're going inside right now." For once, Jacob didn't argue. He allowed her to help him back to the house, his weight heavier against her sturdy frame than she had expected. By the time they reached his bedroom, he was burning with fever and barely conscious. Sarah got him into bed, then sent Daniel running through the snow to fetch Dr. Peterson from town. The old English doctor had served the Amish community for 30 years, earning their trust through his discretion and his willingness to respect their ways. While they waited, Sarah did what she could. Cool cloths for Jacob's fever, warm broth forced between his lips, constant vigilance that left her exhausted but afraid to leave his side. The children huddled in the kitchen, scared and quiet, sensing that something was very wrong. Dr. Peterson arrived as the sun was setting, his black bag clutched in one gnarled hand. He examined Jacob thoroughly while Sarah waited in the hallway, her heart pounding with a fear she hadn't expected to feel so acutely. "Pneumonia," the doctor announced when he emerged from the bedroom. "Severe case. His lungs are badly infected." Sarah felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. "Will he?" "Hard to say," Dr. Peterson replied honestly. "He's a strong man, but he's very sick. The next few days will tell the story. Someone needs to stay with him constantly. Keep the fever down, make sure he drinks fluids, watch for any changes." After the doctor left, Sarah stood in Jacob's doorway, watching her husband fight for each breath. The man who had taken her in out of practical necessity, who had given her a home and a purpose, was dying, and with him would die any chance she had of ever belonging anywhere. But that wasn't why her chest felt tight with panic. Somewhere over the past 2 months, without her even noticing, Jacob Miller had become important to her in ways that had nothing to do with security or shelter. The thought of losing him, really losing him, made her feel hollow and desperate, in a way she had never experienced before. "Ma'am Sarah?" Emma appeared beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Is Dad going to die like our real ma'am did?" Sarah knelt down and pulled the little girl close. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm going to take care of him, and you and Daniel and Mary. Whatever happens, we're going to face it together." The next 3 days passed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. Sarah barely left Jacob's bedside, dozing fitfully in the chair beside his bed, waking at every change in his breathing pattern. She forced fluids down his throat, bathed his fever-racked body with cool cloths, and whispered prayers to a God she wasn't sure was listening. The children took turns sitting with her, their young faces grave with worry. Daniel, who had spent months resenting Jacob's remarriage, now clung to Sarah like she was the only solid thing in a world gone mad. Emma helped with household tasks beyond her years, her small face set with determination. Mary simply held onto Sarah's skirt whenever possible, as if physical contact could keep her new family from dissolving. On the 3rd night, Jacob's fever broke. Sarah woke from an uneasy doze to find him looking at her with clear, rational eyes for the first time in days. His face was gaunt and pale, but the terrible flush of fever was gone. "Sarah," his voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here," she said quickly, reaching for the water glass. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a team of horses." Jacob managed a weak smile. "But alive. Thanks to you." Sarah helped him sit up enough to drink, her hands shaking with relief and exhaustion. The children were so scared. We all were. Jacob's eyes searched her face in the lamplight. "Were you scared?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Was she scared? She had been terrified, but not just of being left alone with 3 children and a farm to manage. She had been terrified of losing Jacob himself. This man who had shown her more kindness in 2 months than she had received in 28 years. "Yes," she whispered. "I was scared." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. For a moment, they simply looked at each other in the quiet bedroom, and Sarah felt as though they were seeing each other clearly for the first time since their wedding day. "Sarah," Jacob said softly, "I need to tell you something." She waited, her heart suddenly pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with his illness. "When I agreed to marry you, it was purely practical. I needed help, you needed a home, and it seemed like a reasonable solution to both our problems." Sarah nodded, though his words stung. She had known this, of course, but hearing it stated so plainly still hurt. "But these past few days, lying here sick, I realized something." Jacob continued. "You didn't have to care for me the way you did. A housekeeper would have done the minimum necessary and called the doctor, But you stayed beside me day and night. You fought for my life like it mattered to you. It does matter to me, Sarah said quietly. Why? The simple question hung between them. Why did it matter to her? When had Jacob Miller become more than just the man who had given her shelter? When had his well-being become tied to her own happiness? Because, Sarah said slowly, somewhere along the way, you stopped being the man who married me out of necessity and became the man I care about. Because you've been kind to me when you didn't have to be. Because you've made me feel like I have value. Like I'm more than just a burden someone was trying to get rid of. Jacob reached out with a trembling hand and touched her face gently. Sarah, you've never been a burden. Not to me, not to the children. You've been a gift. Sarah felt tears spill over. Jacob, I know this wasn't what either of us planned, he said. But maybe we could try to make it something more than just an arrangement. Maybe we could try to build something real. Before Sarah could respond, the bedroom door creaked open and 3 anxious faces peered around it. Dart, Emma whispered. Are you better? Much better, Jacob said, opening his arms. Come here, all of you. The children rushed to the bed, carefully climbing up to hug their father. Sarah started to back away, to give them their reunion, but Jacob caught her hand. Stay, he said simply. You're part of this family too. So Sarah stayed, perched on the edge of the bed, with Jacob's hand in hers, and his children clustered around them like chicks, seeking warmth. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. I love you, Det, Mary said, snuggling against Jacob's chest. I love you too, little one, he replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. Then, his eyes meeting Sarah's over the children's heads, he added quietly, I love all of you. The words weren't specifically for Sarah. Jacob was speaking to all of them, his family, his household, but something in his eyes as he looked at her made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was included in that love in a way she had never dared hope for. Outside, the winter wind continued to howl and the snow piled higher against the window. But inside Jacob Miller's bedroom, surrounded by the warmth of a family that had chosen each other through circumstances rather than blood, Sarah felt something that had been frozen inside her chest for 28 years begin to thaw. Love, not the desperate, grateful attachment she had expected to feel for anyone who showed her kindness, but something deeper and more real. Love for this man who saw value in her when others saw only burden. Love for these children who had accepted her careful affection and returned it with trust. Love for this life that had been built from necessity, but was becoming something beautiful. And for the first time since her wedding day, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, Jacob Miller might someday love her too. Spring came late to Lancaster County that year. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal that seemed to touch everything on the Miller farm. Jacob had recovered fully from his bout with pneumonia, though the experience had changed him in ways that went far deeper than physical health. Sarah noticed it first in the small things, the way he lingered over morning coffee to talk with her about the day's plans, the gentle hand he placed on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, the way he asked her opinion about farm decisions instead of simply informing her of his choices. Most telling of all, he had begun spending his evenings in the kitchen with her and the children instead of retreating to the barn or to his late wife's grave. It had been 6 months since their wedding, and Sarah was beginning to understand what it meant to be truly married, rather than simply housed together. "Ma'am Sarah, look what I found." Mary came running into the kitchen, her small hands cupped carefully around something precious. At 5 now, she had grown taller and more confident, the nightmares that had once plagued her becoming increasingly rare. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, wiping her hands on her apron before kneeling to Mary's level. Mary opened her palms to reveal a tiny blue robin's egg, perfect and unbroken. "It fell from the nest in the apple tree. Can we put it back?" "Let's go try," Sarah said, taking Mary's hand. Together, they walked out to the orchard, where Jacob was pruning branches with Daniel's help. The boy had shot up several inches over the winter and was now nearly as tall as Sarah herself, his voice beginning to crack in the way of adolescent boys everywhere. "Found something that needs returning," Sarah called out, and Jacob climbed down from his ladder to examine Mary's treasure. This is from the Robin family that's been building in the old apple tree," he said seriously, as if Mary had brought him the crown jewels. "Very important that it gets back to its proper place, see?" He lifted Mary onto his shoulders so she could gently place the egg back in the nest, and Sarah watched with a warmth that never seemed to fade. Jacob was such a good father, patient, kind, always willing to stop whatever he was doing to address his children's concerns. It was one of the many things about him that she had come to love deeply. Love. The word no longer frightened her as it once had. Over the long winter months, as she had nursed Jacob back to health and watched their family bond strengthen, Sarah had gradually accepted the truth of her own heart. She loved Jacob Miller, not with the desperate gratitude of a woman saved from spinsterhood, but with the steady, sure affection of a wife who had discovered her husband's true character. Whether Jacob felt the same way about her remained a mystery. He was affectionate and respectful, increasingly warm in his treatment of her, but he had never again spoken as directly about his feelings as he had during his illness. Sarah had learned not to push, not to ask for more than was freely given. She had a home, a family, a purpose, more happiness than she had ever expected to find. If romantic love was not part of the bargain, she could accept that. "Sarah?" Jacob's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Everything all right?" She realized she had been staring at him with an expression that probably revealed more than was wise. "Just enjoying the sunshine," she said quickly. "Spring is beautiful this year." Jacob looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his dark eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." That evening, after the children were in bed, Jacob surprised Sarah by asking if she would take a walk with him. It had become their custom on warm evenings to sit on the porch together, talking quietly about the day's events or simply enjoying the peace of twilight. But a walk was something new. They strolled slowly around the boundaries of the farm, past the newly planted vegetable garden, where Emma's careful rows of seedlings were beginning to emerge, past the pasture, where the goats, Sarah's bride price, grazed contentedly with their new kids. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked suddenly. Sarah looked at him in surprise. "Regret what?" "This." He gestured broadly at the farm, the house, the life they had built together. "Marrying me, leaving your family, taking on children who weren't your own. All of it." The question was so unexpected that Sarah stopped walking entirely. "Regret it, Jacob? This is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged. These children have become as dear to me as if I had given birth to them myself. Why would you think I regret any of it?" "Because you deserved better," Jacob said simply. "You deserved to be chosen for yourself, not accepted as a practical solution. You deserved courtship and romance, and a man who married you because he couldn't imagine living without you." Sarah felt her breath catch. There was something in Jacob's voice, a vulnerability she had never heard before, that made her heart race. "Jacob," she said softly, "do you regret marrying me?" He turned to face her fully, and in the fading light of evening, Sarah saw something in his expression that made her feel dizzy with hope. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "When I married you, I thought I was doing a practical thing. I needed help, you needed a home, and it seemed like a fair exchange. I told myself that was enough, that I could be content with a marriage of convenience after knowing the kind of love I had with Rachel." Each word was like a small wound, even though Sarah had known these truths all along. "But somewhere over these past months, you became more than just the woman who keeps my house and cares for my children. You became the woman who fought for my life when I was sick. The woman who sees past Daniel's anger to the hurt underneath and knows exactly how to heal it. The woman who can make Mary laugh after a nightmare and convince Emma that she's still allowed to be a child, Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. You became the woman who works from dawn to dusk, without complaint, who makes this house feel like a home again, who has given my children back their sense of security and happiness. And somewhere along the way, you became the woman I look forward to seeing first thing every morning and the last thing every night. Jacob stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I know I have no right to ask for more than what we agreed to, he continued. I know this marriage was supposed to be practical, and I know you might not be able to feel the same way about a man who originally saw you as a solution rather than a blessing. But Sarah, I need you to know that I love you. Not because you're convenient, not because you're helpful, but because you're you, because you have the kindest heart and the strongest spirit of anyone I've ever known, because you've made me believe in second chances. Sarah stared at him, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. Jacob, I love you, he repeated firmly, and if there's any part of you that could ever love me back, really love me, not just feel grateful to me, then I'd like to ask you something. What? The word came out as barely a whisper. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden carving, a perfect miniature of a woman in Amish dress, carefully detailed and smoothed to silk. Sarah recognized Daniel's craftsmanship immediately. Daniel made this for me to give to you, Jacob said. He said every woman deserves to know she's beautiful, even if the world has convinced her otherwise. He said, you needed to know that we see you the way God sees you, as exactly the person we needed, created perfectly for this family. Sarah took the carving with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. The tiny wooden woman was round and full-figured, but carved with such care and attention that she seemed to glow with inner beauty. Sarah, Jacob said gently, will you marry me again? Not because it's practical, not because either of us needs something from the other, but because we choose each other, because we love each other. Sarah looked up at him through her tears, this man who had become everything to her, this unexpected love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Jacob, I love you too. I have for months, but I was afraid to hope. Jacob's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Afraid to hope for what? That a man like you could ever truly love a woman like me. Jacob cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. Sarah Miller, he said softly, you are exactly the woman I love. Not despite who you are, but because of who you are. You are beautiful, you are precious, and you are mine. When he kissed her, their first real kiss, born of love rather than obligation, Sarah felt something inside her chest bloom like a flower that had been waiting its whole life for spring. This was what love felt like, not the desperate gratitude she had expected, but this warm, sure certainty that she was cherished exactly as she was. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Sarah realized that she had been wrong about so many things. She had thought she was unmarriageable, but Jacob had chosen to love her. She had thought she was a burden, but she had become a blessing. She had thought she was worth 2 goats, but she had discovered she was worth a lifetime of devotion. Come on, Jacob said, taking her hand. Let's go tell the children they're getting the wedding they deserved to see the first time. As they walked back toward the house, hands intertwined, Sarah caught sight of 3 small faces pressed against the kitchen window, watching their parents with barely contained excitement. Apparently, the children had been hoping for this development as much as Jacob and Sarah themselves. For the first time in her life, Sarah Miller knew exactly where she belonged, not because someone had decided she was useful, but because she was loved, and that made all the difference in the world. 2 years had passed since Jacob's whispered confession of love in the apple orchard, and the Miller farm had become something Sarah had never imagined possible, a place where she was not just tolerated, but treasured. It was Emma, now 10 and wise beyond her years, who noticed the changes first. "Ma'am Sarah," she said one morning as they prepared breakfast together, You look different lately. Prettier. Sarah laughed softly, glancing at her reflection in the kitchen window. I don't think I've changed much, sweetheart. But Emma was right. In ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance. Love had transformed Sarah from the inside out. The constant tension she had carried for 28 years, the expectation of rejection, the readiness to apologize for her existence, had gradually melted away under the steady warmth of Jacob's affection and the children's acceptance. She moved differently now, with confidence instead of apology. She spoke up during community gatherings, offering opinions and ideas that were increasingly sought after by other women. She had even begun teaching some of the younger girls to read and write, a skill that was rare among Amish women but which Sarah had always possessed. Most remarkably, she had begun to lose weight, not through any deliberate effort or special diet, but simply because happiness had changed her relationship with food. Where once she had eaten out of loneliness and boredom, now she ate for nourishment and pleasure, sharing meals with people who loved her company. "Dad says you're the best thing that ever happened to this family," Daniel announced, bursting into the kitchen with the energy of a 14-year-old who had grown 6 inches in the past year. "After Mam, of course," he added quickly, still protective of his birth mother's memory. "Did he now?" Sarah asked, hiding a smile as she handed Daniel his lunch pail. "He tells everyone in town," Daniel continued proudly. "Yesterday at the hardware store, Mr. Fisher asked him how married life was treating him, and Dad said he got the best end of any bargain in the history of Lancaster County." Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest. It still amazed her, this casual affection from the children who had once viewed her with suspicion. Daniel had become her fierce defender, Emma, her trusted confidant, and Mary, sweet Mary, called her simply Mam now, with no qualifier needed. "Speaking of your father," Sarah said, looking out the window, "he should be back soon from the Yoder farm." Jacob had gone to help with a barn raising, a community tradition that brought all the men together for a day of hard labor and fellowship. It was the kind of event where marriages were discussed, children's futures debated, and the general state of the community assessed by those who had lived there longest. When Jacob's wagon finally appeared in the late afternoon, Sarah was surprised to see Bishop Lapp riding alongside him. The bishop's visits were much rarer now than they had been in Sarah's unmarried days, and usually meant either celebration or crisis. "Sarah," Jacob called as he climbed down from the wagon, his face unusually serious. "Could you come out here for a moment?" Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, where Jacob and Bishop Lapp waited with expressions that made her stomach clench with old anxieties. Had someone complained about her? Had the community decided her marriage was somehow improper? Had they come to take away this happiness she had worked so hard to build? "Sarah Miller," Bishop Lapp began formally, "I've come to speak with you about a matter of great importance to our community." Sarah's hands twisted in her apron. Beside her, Jacob reached out and took one of her hands in his, a gesture of support that steadied her. "What matter?" she asked carefully. "Young Anna Byler died in childbirth yesterday," the bishop said gravely. "She leaves behind 3 children under the age of 5 and a husband who cannot manage alone." Sarah's heart ached for the family's loss, but she wasn't sure why this concerned her directly. "Thomas Byler has asked the community for help in finding a suitable wife," Bishop Lapp continued. "Someone mature, capable with children, able to manage a difficult household. Several names have been suggested." A cold fear crept up Sarah's spine. Surely the bishop wasn't suggesting what she thought he was suggesting. "The name that came up most often," Bishop Lapp said, looking directly at Sarah, "was yours." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sarah felt Jacob's hand tighten around hers, felt the porch boards solid beneath her feet, but everything else seemed to be spinning out of control. "Mine," she managed to say. "Word has spread about your excellent management of the Miller household," the bishop explained. "About your skill with children, your ability to bring order to chaos. Thomas Byler specifically requested that we ask if you might consider becoming his wife." "But I'm already married," Sarah said, confusion replacing fear. "Yes, and that brings us to the unusual nature of this request." Bishop Lapp's face was grave. Thomas Byler is prepared to make a substantial offer for your hand. He's offering Jacob 5 acres of prime farmland, plus 3 milk cows. It would double the size of your farm, Jacob, and provide significant financial security for your family. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The bishop was suggesting that Jacob sell her to another man, that their marriage could be dissolved like a business transaction, their love dismissed as easily as livestock changing hands. No, Jacob's voice was quiet but absolutely firm. Bishop Lapp raised an eyebrow. You should consider the offer carefully, Jacob. 5 acres of good land. I said no. Jacob's voice carried a steel that Sarah had never heard before. My wife is not for sale at any price. Jacob, the bishop said patiently, you must think practically. Sarah is a fine woman, but Thomas Byler's need is urgent, and the compensation is substantial. You could marry again easily. There are several young widows who would welcome the security you could provide. Sarah felt sick. The same arguments, the same reduction of her humanity to practical considerations. Even after 2 years of building a life, a family, a love that felt real and lasting, she was still seen as a commodity to be traded when a better offer came along. My wife, Jacob said, his voice rising with anger, is not leaving this farm. Not for 5 acres, not for 50 acres, not for all the land in Pennsylvania. She is my wife, the mother of my children, and she belongs here. Jacob, be reasonable, the bishop began. I am being reasonable. Jacob's voice carried across the yard. What's unreasonable is asking a man to sell his wife like she's a piece of livestock. Sarah is not a transaction. She's my partner, my equal, and the love of my life. And anyone who thinks otherwise can find themselves off my property right now. Sarah stared at her husband in wonder. Jacob Miller, quiet and respectful, Jacob, was facing down the bishop himself in defense of their marriage. He was risking censure from the church, possible shunning from the community, all to make it clear that she was not for sale. The love of my life, he had said. Not just a practical arrangement that had worked out well, but the love of his life. Bishop Lapp's face had grown stern. Jacob, you're allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. The church has a responsibility to place orphaned children with suitable mothers. Then find Thomas Byler, another suitable mother. Jacob interrupted. My wife stays where she is. The bishop studied Jacob's face for a long moment, clearly recognizing that no argument would sway him. Very well, he said finally, but you're turning down an opportunity that may not come again. Good, Jacob replied firmly. I hope it never comes again. After the bishop left, Sarah and Jacob stood together on the porch in the gathering darkness. Sarah felt as though she had been holding her breath for hours and could finally exhale. Jacob, she said softly, you could have doubled your farmland. You could have had financial security for the children's future. Jacob turned to face her, and in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window, his face was full of such love that Sarah felt her knees go weak. Sarah, he said, stepping close enough to cup her face in his hands, do you really think there's any amount of land, any amount of money, any security in the world that would be worth losing you? Do you think I could ever look at another woman and feel what I feel when I look at you? What do you feel? Sarah whispered. Like I'm looking at a queen, Jacob said simply. Like I'm the luckiest man alive because somehow, impossibly, you chose to love me back. Sarah started to protest. She hadn't chosen him. Their marriage had been arranged, but Jacob pressed a gentle finger to her lips. You could have made this marriage miserable for all of us, he said. You could have been resentful, distant. Instead, you chose to love my children as your own. You chose to make my house a home. You chose to care for me when I was sick, to build a life with me instead of just existing in my house. Every day, Sarah, you choose this family, and that makes you more precious than any land or money could ever be. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of 2 years' worth of growing love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest. I love you so much it frightens me sometimes, she admitted. When the bishop suggested that you might trade me away, I thought my heart would stop beating. Never, Jacob said fiercely. I would give up everything before I would give up you, the farm, the house, my place in the community. None of it matters without you here to share it. From inside the house came the sound of running footsteps, and suddenly the porch was filled with 3 children in their nightgowns. We heard shouting, Emma said anxious. Is everything all right? Everything's perfect, Jacob said, pulling all of them close. Someone wanted to take Ma'am Sarah away from us, but I told them she's staying right here where she belongs. Good, Mary said fiercely, wrapping her arms around Sarah's waist. She's our ma'am now, forever. And always, Daniel added, his voice cracking slightly as it continued its adolescent changes. Standing on the porch of their farmhouse, surrounded by the family that had chosen her and the man who loved her beyond all practical considerations, Sarah finally understood what Bishop Lapp had meant all those months ago, when he said that sometimes the best marriages came from unexpected places. She had been sold for 2 goats, had married a stranger out of mutual desperation, had expected nothing more than shelter and basic kindness. Instead, she had found love that treated her like royalty, children who saw her as their mother, and a place in the world where her worth was measured not by her appearance or her family's shame, but by the size of her heart and the depth of her devotion. What are you thinking about? Jacob asked softly as the children ran back inside, chattering excitedly about the drama they had witnessed. Sarah looked at her husband, this unexpected love of her life, and smiled. I'm thinking about how a practical arrangement became the greatest love story I've ever known. Jacob laughed, the sound rich and warm in the evening air. Want to know a secret? What? I got the better end of that bargain, he said, his eyes twinkling. 2 goats for a queen. Your father should have asked for the whole farm. Sarah threw back her head and laughed, the sound echoing across the fields where their love had grown from the most unlikely seeds. She was Sarah Miller, wife to Jacob, mother to Emma, Daniel and Mary, and she was exactly where she belonged. Inside the house, the children were already planning a celebration feast for their parents' real wedding, as Emma called it. Tomorrow, Sarah would wake up as she had for 2 years now in her own home, surrounded by people who loved her, secure in the knowledge that she was wanted and valued and cherished. But tonight she would fall asleep in Jacob's arms, in the bed they now shared as husband and wife in every sense of the word. She would dream of the future they were building together, of the children they were raising, of the love that had transformed them both from broken people into a complete family. The most obese Amish bride in town had indeed been sold for 2 goats, but she had found something worth more than all the land in Lancaster County. She had found unconditional love, and she had learned to love herself through the eyes of those who saw her true beauty. In the end, that made her richer than any queen who had ever worn a crown.